This weekend marked World Mental Health Day, and it feels particularly important this year as we all face the worrying uncertainty that coronavirus brings. Alastair Campbell, Tony Blair's former Director of Communications, has spoken out in the past about his own personal experience, and he's written a book on surviving depression. He joins us now. You've been very open about your own mental health challenges. You've spoken very eloquently about it before. Just explain to people who might not have been familiar with what happened about your own experience.
Well, the book is about my mental health story and also that of my family. So my own psychosis and alcohol problems in the 80s. I had a brother who's now dead, sadly, who had schizophrenia, another brother who had addiction issues, a cousin who took his own life. So I've tried to kind of tell that story, but in the broader context of what I think is a growing mental health crisis, which is going to be exacerbated by some of the things that you've been talking about earlier in the programme. So I've really tried to address my own mental health, and I think I'm now in a better shape than I've ever been because I've really gone into it deep. But also then the second part of the book, Living Better, is about actually trying to find other ways that other people in different parts of the world are looking at depression. And I call it the search for a cure. I'm not sure we'll ever get a cure, but I do think there are things that we can do for ourselves and for each other that can help us to deal with depression much better.
And it feels particularly important at the moment with the anxiety that we all feel, no matter what our own experiences are with mental health, with the pandemic. I mean, it must be a really, really difficult time for so many people who are battling with their mental health.
Well, it's interesting. Mind and other mental health charities have been very, very clear that although, yes, everybody's struggling to a certain degree with anxiety, those who have pre-existing mental health conditions are the ones who are struggling most. And I think it was really interesting actually watching your programme just now. In a sense, the whole story of COVID, I think, has been that the government has been constantly trying to catch up with decisions that it should have been planning for. And I think the Royal College of Psychiatrists have said that they think mental illness is going to be the second pandemic of COVID. We've seen a huge rise in people reporting symptoms of depression. The suicide figures are going up. And we've got an economic catastrophe coming down the track. And we know what happened the last time with the global financial crisis. There is a direct link to suicide. Now, if you've got that, if you know that's coming, it's the duty of government to plan for that. And I don't have any sense of the government planning for this. You hear other world leaders, they talk about mental health. People like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand, Angela Merkel, Cuomo in New York, they've been talking about the mental health implications from the word go. And I don't think that the government's even got this on its radar.
It is concerning. There was research by Sky News that showed that over the last 6 months, there were actually over 200,000 fewer referrals to mental health services compared to last year. I was speaking earlier this week to the chief executive of SANE, the mental health charity, saying that a lot of people are worried about putting extra strain on the NHS, about coming forward with when they are really suffering from mental health issues. Are you worried people aren't seeking out the help they need?
Well, look, that is definitely happening. You talk to, and look, I've been doing that myself. I mean, I had a bit of I had a manic spell in lockdown, and I also had a very big dip. And you find yourself thinking, oh, well, I'll just kind of see it through and I think that's a natural reaction because we're all conscious of the fact that COVID is such a big problem for our health services. But I get the feeling now that this actually, if we're not careful, is going to become an even bigger problem, because what seems to be happening is, yes, the cases are going back up. The death rate seems to be being kept fairly low, fairly stable. But I think these mental health conditions, they're storing up and they're storing up and they're storing up. And so I think it's been interesting to listen to people in the health service saying, look, if you are kind of struggling, if you are suffering, please do come forward. So I think that we've got to understand that this is going to be the next wave of this. And I really, really worry the government's not on the case. I saw, you mentioned it was World Mental Health Day yesterday. I watched Boris Johnson's video about that. I mean, there was nothing in it apart from a few cliches and platitudes and a few references to Winston Churchill having had depression. This is going to be the next big challenge for government, and they've got to start preparing for it.
You mentioned there your own experiences during sort of lockdown, during the pandemic. What would your advice be to people watching the show maybe who feel that they're struggling? Is there any things that people can do just to try and make themselves feel better, to try and pull themselves out? Is there any advice that you can give people?
Well, it is hard, and it's very hard to sort of give general advice to people who will be having their own very, very personal struggles. But I do think that talking is the single most important thing that you can do. I actually think, in the book, my partner Fiona has written a chapter about what it's like living with me when I'm depressed. And it was actually interesting for me to read that, to get her sense. We've obviously talked about it for 40 years, but actually sometimes when you write things down, you get a better sense. And what's interesting from her perspective was that she felt there was nothing she could do. And yet, for me, as the person who was going through the depressions at pretty much every stage of the 40 years we've been together, actually her just being there for me to talk to when I felt like talking was incredibly important. So the most important thing to me is actually to not to feel ashamed, never to feel that it's anybody's fault. It just is. Depression, anxiety, these conditions just are. But I often feel now the fact that whereas I used to be in denial about it, I'm used to not talk about it, now that I'm very open about it, the first thing I do when I feel it coming on is say to Fiona, it's happening again. We've both worked out ways to deal with that better. So I'd say talking is the single most important thing that we can do, whether with a family member, a friend, a colleague, or it may be with a medical professional. But just talk is the best way out of it.
Thank you. It's really good advice there, and obviously very important for people like yourself with a public profile, people who've been very successful in their lives, to talk about your own experiences. So we really thank you for coming on the programme to doing that.
Thank you.